I never thought I'd witness my sweet Grandma Eleanor sitting helplessly on the curb, tears streaming down her face, but that's exactly the scene that hit me when I pulled into the neighborhood that afternoon. There she was, stranded outside her own home, as Mr. Henderson, the Homeowners Association president, smugly wheeled her only way to get around down the street. My blood ran cold as I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of my car. Neighbors were already gathering, gasping in disbelief and pulling out their phones to record the whole thing. I could barely process what was happening. "Ethan, he took it. He just took my wheelchair right out from under me," Grandma Eleanor called out to me, her voice trembling with a mix of humiliation and anger. Mr. Henderson, dressed in his perfectly pressed khakis and polo shirt, didn't even glance back as he continued wheeling my grandmother's custom wheelchair away like it was abandoned property. I had never felt such immediate rage in my entire life, but something told me this confrontation needed to be handled differently than my gut was telling me to. Just 5 days earlier, I had helped Grandma Eleanor move into the Oakwood Estates neighborhood so she could be closer to family after my grandpa passed away at 82. Eleanor had recently lost most of her mobility due to complications from arthritis and a series of minor strokes. Her customized wheelchair wasn't just a convenience, it was her lifeline, specially fitted with the support she needed for her specific medical condition. It was admittedly a larger model, bulkier than standard wheelchairs, but absolutely necessary for her comfort and independence. We had carefully chosen this neighborhood because of its single-level homes and what seemed like a friendly community atmosphere. Little did we know that beneath the manicured lawns and coordinated mailboxes lurked a tyrant who valued appearances over people. Mr. Henderson, the Homeowners Association president for 8 years running, had built a reputation for maintaining the pristine look of Oakwood Estates, but as we would soon find out, his methods were anything but neighborly. The trouble started on Grandma Eleanor's very first afternoon in her new home. I had helped her onto the front porch to soak up the spring sunshine while I unpacked boxes inside. Her wheelchair sat at the bottom of the 3 shallow steps leading to the porch, perfectly positioned for when she needed to go back inside. I was organizing kitchen supplies when the doorbell rang insistently. Opening the door, I came face to face with Harold Henderson for the first time. "Is this your grandmother's wheelchair?" he demanded without an introduction, pointing accusingly at the mobility device below. When I confirmed that yes, it belonged to my grandmother who was enjoying her new porch, his face tightened with disapproval. "I'm afraid leaving medical equipment visible from the street is against Homeowners Association policy, Section 12, Paragraph 4, no personal belongings may be stored on front lawns or driveways in a manner visible from the street. It clutters the look of the neighborhood," he said, handing me a thick binder of Homeowners Association regulations. I politely explained that this wasn't stored equipment but rather Grandma Eleanor's only means of mobility, temporarily placed for easy access. Mr. Henderson seemed unmoved by this distinction, informing me that exceptions create precedents and that we would need to find a more appropriate storage solution. Over the next few days, the situation escalated at an alarming rate. First came the written warning tucked under the doormat, then a formal notice of violation taped to the front door, threatening fines of $100 per day if the violation continued. I tried calling the Homeowners Association office only to discover that Mr. Henderson essentially was the office. All complaints went directly through him. I attempted to reason with him, scheduling a meeting where I brought medical documentation explaining my grandmother's needs. "This is a medical necessity, not a decorative choice," I explained patiently. "The Americans with Disabilities Act protects her right to reasonable accommodations." Mr. Henderson listened with thinly veiled contempt before responding that the Homeowners Association rules predated such legislation and that private communities had certain exemptions. "We all make sacrifices to maintain property values," he said with a dismissive wave. "Your grandmother will simply need to adapt to our standards, not the other way around." I left that meeting frustrated but determined to find a diplomatic solution, perhaps by appealing to the full Homeowners Association board at their next meeting scheduled for the following month. Mr. Henderson, however, had no intention of waiting for due process. 3 days after our meeting, While I was at work and a home health aide had stepped inside to prepare lunch, he made his move. Grandma Eleanor was enjoying a rare moment of independence, sitting in her wheelchair in the sunshine of her front yard, watching birds at the feeder we had installed. According to Mrs. Peterson next door, who witnessed everything, Mr. Henderson marched up the sidewalk with two association maintenance workers in tow. Without so much as a greeting, he announced, "This is your final warning, Mrs. Connor. This medical equipment cannot remain visible from the street." My grandmother, confused but dignified, explained that her caregiver was just inside and would help her back into the house shortly. "That isn't good enough," Mr. Henderson reportedly said, checking his expensive watch with an exaggerated gesture. "The association has voted to enforce all violations immediately." With that, he gestured to his workers, who looked uncomfortable but followed orders. They lifted my shocked grandmother out of her chair and placed her unceremoniously on the nearby bench. My grandmother later told me that one of the workers whispered, "I'm sorry, ma'am," as they moved her, his eyes downcast with shame. As she protested, Mr. Henderson took control of the wheelchair himself and began wheeling it away, informing her that it would be held at the association office until proper arrangements could be made for its discreet storage and use. Mrs. Peterson, who had been gardening nearby, rushed over when she realized what was happening. "Harold Henderson, have you lost your mind?" she called out, hurrying to Grandma Eleanor's side. "You can't just take someone's wheelchair." But Mr. Henderson merely raised his hand dismissively without even turning around. "Association business, Clara. Stay out of it unless you want another citation for those unapproved rose bushes." The threat was enough to silence Mrs. Peterson's vocal objections, though she immediately called me and then stayed with my grandmother until I could arrive. By the time I arrived on the scene after receiving a panicked call from the health aide, a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Peterson was sitting beside my grandmother, comforting her while glaring daggers at Mr. Henderson's retreating form. Several neighbors were already making phone calls, some to emergency services, others to local news stations. One young mother was live-streaming the whole thing on social media, her voice shaking with anger as she narrated the events. I briefly checked on Grandma Eleanor, assuring her that I would fix this, before rushing after Mr. Henderson. I caught up to him at the community clubhouse, where he was attempting to store the wheelchair in a maintenance closet. "You cannot legally take essential medical equipment from a disabled person," I stated firmly, blocking his path. "Return it immediately, or I'll call 911 and report theft." Mr. Henderson's face reddened, but his voice remained cold. "This is association property now, confiscated according to Bylaw 16. You can apply for its return after paying the accumulated fines and submitting a proper storage plan." Something in his smug certainty told me that direct confrontation would get me nowhere. I took a deep breath, stepped back, and pulled out my phone. "I'm not calling the police yet," I said quietly. "I'm calling everyone else first. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." And call everyone I did that evening. As Grandma Eleanor rested in a temporary wheelchair loaned by a sympathetic neighbor, I launched what would become the most effective community organizing campaign Oakwood Estates had ever seen. I started with the association board members themselves, most of whom were horrified to learn what had been done in their name. Apparently, Mr. Henderson had consulted none of them before taking such drastic action. He told us he was handling a minor violation, nothing about confiscating medical equipment from an elderly resident, explained Robert Jenkins, the board treasurer, his voice shaking with anger when I reached him by phone. Next came calls to local disability rights advocates, who immediately recognized the Americans with Disabilities Act violations at play. "This is a textbook case of discrimination," said Maria Vasquez from the County Disability Rights Coalition after hearing our story. "We'll have a legal representative at any meeting you organize." By morning, 2 local news vans were parked outside our home, and my social media post describing the incident had been shared over 5,000 times. The hashtag #GiveEleanor her chair back was trending locally, with residents from neighboring communities expressing outrage and solidarity. Most importantly, I secured the community center for an emergency town hall meeting that evening, bypassing Mr. Henderson's authority by having 3 board members co-sign the request. "He can't stop this," assured Mrs. Lawrence, the board secretary, who had apparently been waiting years for an opportunity to challenge Henderson's authority. "The bylaws clearly state that 3 board signatures can call an emergency meeting without presidential approval. He never thought we'd actually use that clause against him." As I distributed flyers throughout the neighborhood, I discovered that our situation had merely been the breaking point for a community already simmering with resentment everywhere I went. Residents shared their own stories of Henderson's tyranny. "He fined me $300 for planting unapproved flowers," shared Mrs. Williams, an elderly widow who had lived in the community since its founding. "They were my late husband's favorite variety, the same ones we'd had for 20 years before Henderson took over." Mr. Chin recounted how Henderson had personally removed his children's basketball hoop while they were at school, claiming it degraded neighborhood aesthetics despite being mounted properly on their own garage. The Johnsons had been threatened with legal action for parking a work vehicle in their own driveway overnight, even though Mr. Johnson was an emergency room doctor who sometimes needed quick access to his car for hospital calls. The town hall meeting that evening exceeded all expectations. The community center was standing room only, with residents from all 5 neighborhoods under the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association packed in shoulder to shoulder. Local news cameras captured it all as resident after resident stepped forward to share their stories of intimidation, selective enforcement, and outright bullying at the hands of Mr. Henderson. A retired attorney outlined the legal violations inherent in confiscating medical equipment. Representatives from the County Disability Services Office explained the legal ramifications of denying reasonable accommodations, with one specialist pointing out that Henderson's actions potentially constituted both civil rights violations and elder abuse. The room grew increasingly animated as decades of pent-up frustrations found voice. "He threatened to put a lien on my house because my azaleas were the wrong shade of pink," one woman testified, her voice trembling with remembered humiliation. An elderly man described how Henderson had personally supervised the removal of a small memorial bench he had installed in memory of his deceased wife, claiming it violated the No Unapproved Structures policy. A young couple shared how they'd been harassed about their child's adaptive playground equipment, installed for their son with cerebral palsy. What truly shifted the mood of the room from anger to determined action was when the association's former secretary, who had resigned 3 years earlier, revealed that she had copies of financial records suggesting Henderson had been diverting fine money for personal use. "I left because I couldn't be part of it anymore," she explained, passing folders to the current board members, "but I kept copies of everything. I've been waiting for the right moment to come forward." The most powerful moment came when we carefully helped Grandma Eleanor to the front of the room in her borrowed wheelchair. Despite my concerns that the experience might be too stressful for her, she had insisted on speaking. "I've lived through segregation, workplace discrimination, and the loss of my beloved husband," she said in her quiet but firm voice that somehow commanded complete silence from the packed room. "I never expected to be treated as less than human simply because I need wheels instead of legs to move around. This isn't about a wheelchair or about rules, it's about seeing the humanity in your neighbors." She paused, looking directly at Mr. Henderson, who had arrived late and stood at the back with his arms crossed. "When you took my wheelchair, Mr. Henderson, you didn't just take a piece of metal and plastic. You took my dignity, my independence, and my right to exist comfortably in my own home. Is that really the kind of community we want to be?" The room erupted in supportive applause as tears flowed freely. Mr. Henderson found himself completely isolated, with even his most loyal supporters keeping their distance, as if his cruelty might somehow be contagious. The turning point came when Councilwoman Maria Santos, who represented our district on the city council, stepped forward. "What we've witnessed here goes beyond homeowners association overreach," she announced. "The confiscation of medically necessary equipment from a disabled resident potentially constitutes a civil rights violation under both state and federal law. I am hereby requesting the county attorney to investigate." A cheer went up from the crowd. The association board members, clearly sensing which way the wind was blowing, huddled together in urgent consultation. The board president, a normally timid accountant named Robert Jenkins, approached the microphone with newfound resolution. "The board is calling an emergency session, effective immediately," he announced. "Mr. Henderson is suspended from his duties pending a full investigation. Additionally, we move to return Mrs. Connor's wheelchair immediately, with the association's most sincere apologies." Another round of applause filled the room as Mr. Henderson's face turned from red to purple. He attempted to object but found his microphone cut off as the board secretary, a retired judge, calmly explained the bylaws regarding emergency suspension of officers, bylaws that, ironically, Henderson himself had helped institute years earlier to consolidate his power. The next morning brought an even more satisfying development. Mayor Gloria Washington herself arrived at our doorstep, accompanied by the association board and local news cameras. "On behalf of our entire community, I want to personally apologize for this unconscionable treatment," she announced as cameras rolled. "Our town prides itself on being accessible and welcoming to all. What happened here was not just a violation of homeowners association policies, it was a violation of basic human dignity." She then presented Grandma Eleanor with a formal proclamation declaring a new inclusive community initiative to review all regulations that might impact residents with disabilities. But the true highlight came when Robert Jenkins wheeled forward Grandma Eleanor's original wheelchair, now adorned with flowers and a large red bow. "The association has unanimously voted to return your property with our deepest apologies," he said, handing me the keys to a brand new wheelchair-accessible ramp that would be installed at our front entrance the following day at the association's expense. "For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." As neighbors cheered and cameras flashed, I helped Grandma Eleanor back into her properly fitted wheelchair. The look of relief and dignity that spread across her face was worth more than any victory against Mr. Henderson. The formal vote to remove Harold Henderson from office came exactly 1 week later at a special association meeting that drew record attendance. The conference room at the local library barely contained the crowd as the board secretary read the results of their investigation: 23 verified complaints of selective enforcement, 15 instances of rule changes implemented without proper board approval, and most damning of all, evidence that fines collected had been used to renovate Henderson's own property without board authorization. The motion to permanently remove Harold Henderson from the position of Homeowners Association president passes with 97% of votes in favor, announced Jenkins, now firmly established in his interim leadership role. Mr. Henderson, who had arrived with an attorney in tow, attempted to protest but found himself drowned out by applause as he stormed toward the exit. Neighborhood children moved their chairs to clear a wide path, not out of respect, but to dramatically demonstrate the wheelchair accessibility that would now be required throughout the community. The symbolism was lost on no one, and ripples of laughter followed Henderson out the door. In his place, the association elected a new leadership council comprising 7 residents, including 2 with disabilities and 1 from each neighborhood section. Their first official act was passing a comprehensive accessibility amendment, ensuring that all common areas and regulations would prioritize inclusion over aesthetics. The change that swept through Oakwood Estates was remarkable to witness. Within days, the new council had distributed updated guidelines emphasizing the spirit rather than merely the letter of community standards. Signs appeared throughout the neighborhood designating accessible parking areas and pathways. The former Aesthetics Committee was replaced with a Community Inclusion and Beautification Committee, tasked with ensuring that all decisions served the diverse needs of residents. Most touching was the Grandma Eleanor rule, which explicitly protected the rights of residents to maintain necessary medical equipment without fear of penalties or harassment. As for Grandma Eleanor herself, she blossomed in ways I hadn't expected. The formerly timid woman who had worried about being a burden now rolled confidently through the neighborhood, greeting neighbors and supervising the installation of accessible features throughout the community. The association unanimously voted to appoint her as an honorary consultant to their newly formed Accessibility Committee. Who better to advise us than the woman whose courage changed everything? Robert Jenkins explained at the announcement ceremony, presenting her with a small plaque that now hangs proudly in her living room. The local news featured her story in a special segment on community activism, and the mayor's office invited her to speak at the upcoming Town Accessibility Forum. Several other homeowners associations in neighboring communities reached out to learn from our experience, with two of them subsequently revising their own policies to better accommodate residents with disabilities. The ripple effects of one woman's stand against injustice continued to spread, but my favorite moment came one sunny afternoon as we strolled through the neighborhood. Passing Mr. Henderson's now quiet house with its for sale sign prominently displayed. According to neighborhood gossip, he had been quietly approached by several realtors who suggested that, given recent events, his property might face unusual challenges on the market. Apparently, his reputation had become so toxic that potential buyers were being warned about him before. Henderson, the man who had been so obsessed with property values, was now learning a painful lesson about the true cost of community trust. Grandma Eleanor paused her wheelchair, looked up at me with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, and said, "You know, Ethan, I've been thinking of painting my wheelchair purple with glitter. What do you think the old rules would have said about that?" We both burst into laughter that carried across the newly accessible sidewalks of a community forever changed because one woman refused to accept injustice, even from her wheelchair.